On April 9, 1241, a silence hung over the fields near the city of Legnica, in the fractured Duchy of Silesia. It was a silence that felt heavy, unnatural, and pregnant, with a violence that the Western world had never truly seen before. On one side of the field stood the flower of European chivalry. There were Duke Henry the Pious of Silesia, contingents of French Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, Teutonic Knights, and a assembled levy of Polish nobility, Bavarian miners, and conscripted infantry. They were clad in heavy chainmail, gripping lances of ash wood, confident in the weight of their iron and the righteousness of their God. They represented the pinnacle of medieval European warfare, a hammer designed to smash anything that stood before it. On the other side stood an army that looked like nothing the knights had ever encountered. They were smaller men on smaller horses. They wore silk beneath leather armor. They carried curved swords and stiff, recurve bows made of horn and sinew. They did not line up in the rigid, honorable formations of the West. They swirled. They moved with a fluid, predatory grace, communicating not with shouting heralds, but with the silent waving of banners and the rhythmic beating of heavy drums. These were the Mongols. Specifically, this was the northern detachment of the Golden Horde, commanded by Baidar and Kaidan, grandsons of the great Khan Genghis. They were thousands of miles from home, deep in unknown territory, and yet they looked entirely at ease. What happened next was not merely a battle. It was a collision of two completely different worlds, two incompatible philosophies of war, and two civilizations engaging in a violent dialogue that would leave scars on the psyche of Eastern Europe for centuries. To understand the slaughter at Legnica, we must look beyond the clash of swords and understand the tidal wave of history that brought these horsemen from the steppes of Mongolia to the muddy fields of Poland. The year 1241 was a time of existential dread for Christendom. Rumors had been filtering west for years about a new scourge from the east. Refugees spoke of a distinct people, often referred to as Tartars, who moved faster than the wind and drank the blood of their horses. But to the proud dukes and kings of Europe, these were just stories, barbarian raids that could be crushed by the heavy cavalry charge, the tactic that had dominated European battlefields for centuries. The European way of war was built on shock. It was built on the idea that a mass of heavy iron moving at speed was unstoppable. It was a direct, brutal, and often clumsy affair. The Mongol way of war was entirely different. It was engineered. It was the product of a military machine perfected by Genghis Khan and honed by his brilliant general Subutai. The Mongols did not view war as a chance for personal glory or chivalric display. To them, war was a hunt. The enemy was game to be herded, trapped, and slaughtered with maximum efficiency and minimum risk to the hunter. They valued speed, deception, and psychological terror above all else. The invasion of Europe was not a random raid. It was a meticulously planned strategic operation. Subutai, the mastermind behind the campaign, had set his sights on Hungary. But he knew that if he invaded Hungary, the Poles and the Germans to the north would likely send reinforcements to aid their Christian neighbors. To prevent this, Subutai split his massive force. The main army would ride into Hungary to crush King Bela IV. A smaller, diversionary force of roughly 2 tumens, about 20,000 men, was sent north into Poland. Their mission was not necessarily to conquer Poland, but to sow chaos, burn cities, and draw out the northern armies so they could not march south. This northern force was the one that now stared down Henry the Pious at Legnica. The road to Legnica had been paved with ash. The Mongols had swept through the Polish lands with terrifying speed. They had burned Sandomierz. They had crushed the armies of lesser nobles at Tursko and Śmielnik. They had reached the city of Krakow, the spiritual heart of the kingdom, and left it a smoking ruin. The speed of their advance paralyzed the European leadership. By the time a duke could rally his vassals, the Mongols were already in his territory. By the time he could form a battle line, they were behind him. Duke Henry II, known as the Pious, was the best hope for the defense of Poland. He was a capable ruler, a man of deep faith, and a member of the Pious dynasty that had sought to unify the fragmented Polish duchies. He had retreated to Legnica, a strategic fortress city, to gather every available sword. He sent desperate pleas to the monarchs of the West, but the Holy Roman Emperor was embroiled in a feud with the Pope, and the King of Hungary was already facing the main Mongol thrust. Henry was largely alone, save for the military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, who understood the gravity of the threat better than anyone else. As the armies deployed on that cold April morning, the disparity was stark. Henry organized his forces into 4 distinct divisions. The first consisted of the gold miners from the town of Goldburg and Bavarian settlers, men who were brave but lacked the discipline of professional soldiers. The second and third divisions were made up of knights from Lesser Poland and Silesia. The fourth, the elite reserve, was commanded by Henry himself and included the best of his heavy cavalry and the veteran warrior monks of the military orders. The Mongols, by contrast, seemed to have no fixed center. They deployed in a loose formation, their horse archers buzzing at the edges of the field. The European knights, looking through the narrow slits of their helmets, would have seen the strange standards of the enemy, tails of yak hair blowing in the wind. They would have heard the eerie whistling sound of the Mongol arrows, which were often fitted with specially carved bone whistles to create a terrifying psychological effect as they rained down. The battle began with a move that typified the European misunderstanding of their enemy. The first division, the miners and infantry, charged. It was a brave, desperate lunge to close the distance. In a traditional European battle, the 2 infantry lines would clash and grind against each other. But the Mongols did not stand and fight. As the Europeans rushed forward, the Mongol front line simply dissolved. They wheeled their horses around and retreated, firing arrows backward over the croups of their horses, the famous Parthian shot. The infantry was left swinging at air, exposed and confused. Then, the arrows came. The Mongol composite bow was a marvel of engineering, capable of punching through mail armor at close range. The miners were decimated before they could even strike a blow. Seeing his vanguard crumbling, Henry committed his cavalry. The second and third divisions lowered their lances and spurred their heavy destriers into a gallop. The earth shook under the pound. Ding of hooves. This was the moment the knights lived for, the charge, the impact. At first, it seemed to work. The Mongol light cavalry, unable to withstand the shock of the heavy horses, broke and fled. The knights, seeing the backs of their enemies, roared in triumph. They believed the day was won. They believed the barbarians were routing. They spurred their horses faster, breaking their formation in their eagerness to run down the fleeing enemy. They did not know they were riding into a trap. The feigned retreat was the signature tactic of the steppe. It relied on the discipline of the troops to run away convincingly, drawing the enemy out of position, stretching their lines, and tiring their horses. The Mongols practiced this maneuver until they could execute it in their sleep. As the Polish and German knights chased the fleeing Mongols, they became separated from their infantry support. Their heavy horses, carrying men armored in chainmail and boiled leather, began to tire. Suddenly, a signal was given. A smoke screen, possibly created by burning reeds or even a primitive chemical composition, drifted across the battlefield, obscuring vision and creating panic. Some chronicles even suggest the use of poisoned smoke, a testament to the alien and terrifying nature of the Mongol arsenal. Out of this smog and confusion, the fleeing Mongols suddenly turned. At the same moment, fresh reserves of heavy Mongol cavalry, lancers clad in lamellar armor, slammed into the flanks of the disorganized European knights. The hunter became the hunted. The knights, their momentum gone, their horses blown, found themselves surrounded. The mobility that was the Mongols' greatest asset now became a cage. They circled the Europeans, tightening the noose. The horse archers rode in circles, pouring thousands of arrows into the huddled mass of knights. They aimed for the horses, ending the knights crashing to the ground where they could be finished off with maces and daggers. It was a massacre. The European style of individual combat, where a knight sought out a worthy opponent for a duel, was useless here. The Mongols fought as a unit, a collective organism of destruction. They used lassos to drag knights from their saddles. They used long lances with hooks to pull riders down. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse of mud and blood. Duke Henry, seeing the disaster unfolding, committed his elite reserve. He led the charge himself, hoping to break the encirclement and save his men. For a moment, the fury of the Duke and his personal guard, along with the disciplined Templars, pushed the Mongols back. But the numbers and the tactics were against them. The Mongols separated Henry from his bodyguards. The chronicles describe a desperate last stand. Henry, his horse wounded, fought on foot, surrounded by a sea of enemies. He was eventually brought down. The Mongols, who respected courage but showed no mercy, cut off his head. They paraded it on the tip of a spear beneath the walls of the nearby town of Legnica, a gruesome trophy to demoralize the defenders. The sight of their duke's head, hair matted with blood, staring vacantly from a pike, broke the spirit of the region. The scale of the defeat was catastrophic. The cream of the Silesian and Polish nobility lay dead. The Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights was dead or missing. The flower of the military orders had been cut down. To count the dead, the Mongols cut an ear off each fallen enemy. It is said they filled 9 large sacks with these grisly trophies. But what happened after the battle is almost as fascinating as the combat itself. By all conventional logic, the road to the west was now open. There was no army left in Poland capable of stopping the Mongols. They could have ridden into Germany, crossed the Rhine, and perhaps even reached the Atlantic. The terror in Paris and London was palpable. Emperor Frederick II shut himself away. Queen Blanche of France asked King Louis IX if this was the end of the world, and then the Mongols stopped. They did not push further west into Germany. They lingered for a short while, raiding the countryside, and then they turned south. They rode through Moravia to link up with Subutai's main force in Hungary, which had just annihilated the Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohi only 2 days after Legnica. This pivot reveals the true genius and discipline of the Mongol military machine. They were not a mindless horde bent on endless destruction for its own sake. They were soldiers following orders. Their mission was to protect the flank of the main invasion force. They had achieved that mission. They had destroyed the northern armies. They had ensured that no reinforcements would come to save Hungary. Having completed their objective, they consolidated their forces. The aftermath of Legnica left Europe in a state of shock that would last for generations. It shattered the myth of European military superiority. It proved that the heavy cavalry charge, the tactic that had defined the social and military order of feudalism, was not invincible. It forced European commanders to rethink their strategies, sparking a gradual evolution in military technology and tactics that would eventually lead to the rise of professional armies and the decline of the knightly class. However, the Mongol withdrawal from Europe a year later remains one of the great what-ifs of history. In 1242, a messenger arrived from the east with news that shook the Mongol leadership. The great Khan Ogedei had died in Karakorum. By Mongol law, the princes of the blood, including Batu and the commanders at Legnica, were required to return to Mongol, i.e. to elect a new Khan. The invasion was called off. The armies turned their horses around and rode back toward the steppes of Russia, leaving a devastated but surviving Europe in their wake. If Ogedei had lived another 10 years or even another 2, it is entirely possible that the Mongols would have returned to finish what they started at Legnica. The Holy Roman Empire, France, and perhaps even England could have fallen under the yoke of the Golden Horde. The history of Western civilization would have been rewritten entirely, but they did not return. Legnica remained a singular, horrific scar. For the Polish people, it became a symbol of martyrdom and sacrifice. Henry the Pious became a national hero, the defender of the faith and the homeland, a man who gave his life to shield the West from the storm of the East. A church was built on the site of the battle, and for centuries, pilgrims would visit the place where the Christian knights had fallen. The battle also had profound demographic and political consequences for the region. The depopulation caused by the Mongol sword led the Silesian dukes to invite German settlers to repopulate the land. This influx of German farmers, merchants, and artisans would shift the cultural makeup of Silesia for the next 700 years, planting the seeds of future conflicts and shifting borders that would last until the 20th century. Furthermore, the battle highlighted the chronic weakness of the fractured Polish state. The inability of the various dukes to coordinate a unified defense against a centralized, disciplined enemy was a harsh lesson. It would take nearly a century for Poland to reunify and emerge as a major power capable of defending its own borders, a process forged in the fires of the Mongol trauma. When we look back at the Battle of Legnica today, we must strip away the romanticism of the medieval chronicle. We must look past the stained glass images of pious knights and demonic invaders. What we find is a brutal lesson in military efficiency. We see the clash between a feudal society, where war was a ritualized extension of personal honor, and a meritocratic empire, where war was a science of logistics, mobility, and psychological manipulation. The Mongols at Legnica were not just better fighters, they were better thinkers. They understood the terrain, They understood their enemy's psychology. They knew that the impetuous pride of the knights was a weapon that could be turned against them. They used the knights' own aggression as the lever to destroy them. The image of the Mongol archer, twisting in his saddle to fire backward at the pursuing knight, is the defining image of the battle. It represents the triumph of agility over brute force, of adaptability over tradition. The European knight was a fortress on horseback, designed to withstand a frontal assault. The Mongol warrior was the wind, impossible to pin down, striking from everywhere and nowhere at once. In the end, Legnica serves as a grim reminder of the fragility of civilization. On that April morning, the people of Silesia woke up believing in the security of their stone castles and their iron-clad protectors. By sunset, their world had been unmade. The illusion of safety was shattered by the whistling of arrows and the thunder of hooves. The legacy of the battle is not just in the tombs of the fallen dukes or the chronicles of the monks. It is in the genetic memory of Europe, a lingering fear of the East that would influence politics and culture for centuries. It was the moment when the map of the world suddenly expanded in the most violent way possible, forcing Europe to realize that it was not the center of the universe, but merely a peninsula on the edge of a vast, dangerous, and interconnected Eura. Xi'an landmass. The silence that fell over the field of Legnica on the evening of April 9, 1241, was the silence of the grave. The snows had melted, and the spring grass was beginning to grow, fed by the blood of thousands. The Mongols moved on, their mission complete, leaving behind a continent forever changed, forever fearful, and forever wondering when the thunder of the East might return. The knights of Europe had fought with valor, with faith, and with the full weight of their tradition, but at Legnica they learned a terrible truth. Courage alone is no defense against a superior machine of war. As the sun set on the corpse-strewn field, the Golden Horde vanished as quickly as it had appeared, dissolving into the mists of history, leaving only the smoke of burning cities.